Perfecto. Muy buenos días para todas y para todos. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas nuevamente al seminario de investigación de la Facultad de Ciencias Naturales. El día de hoy nos acompaña el doctor Douglas Hamilton y el profesor Sergio en breve realizará la presentación de nuestro invitado y un poco la introducción al tema. Les voy a recordar unos temas datos muy específicos respecto al registro de asistencia y la participación, cómo la vamos a manejar para este seminario en particular. Entonces, para registro de asistencia, yo les voy a dejar un chat, en el chat, perdón, el respectivo enlace del formulario. Y respecto a la participación, si ustedes necesitan hacer algún tipo de aclaración durante la presentación del profesor Douglas, por favor levanten la mano o lo escriben en el chat. Esto relacionado solamente con aclaraciones del tema que él está tratando. Pero si tenemos preguntas, las podemos dejar al finalizar la sesión. Espero haberles dado la claridad respectiva. Y, profesor Sergio, por favor, continuemos. Gracias.
Gracias, Verónica. Buenos días para todas, para todos y para todes. I'm going to switch to English now. So I'm thrilled to have Douglas with us today. I want to thank him for allocating some time on his busy Friday. And so Douglas did his undergraduate and master's at the University of East Anglia at the UK, where he studied the Efhala volcanic eruption in 2010. It's a volcano in Ireland. I'm sure he's going to be able to pronounce that name perfectly as an Icelandic would. He then fascinated about Ash's biochemical cycles. He undertook a PhD at the University of Leeds, also in the UK, in aerosol climate modeling, followed by a postdoc at Cornell. Right now, he's an assistant professor in the Earth System Sciences in the Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Science Department at North Carolina State University in the United States. And much of his interest right now revolves around further understanding the roles of fires in the Earth system and how human activity is reshaping the fire regime during the Anthropocene. He's also an artist, and he was an artist before becoming a scientist. So he thoroughly enjoys thinking of new ways to bridge those two worlds, the science, communication, visualization, and hardcore science. So thank you, Douglas, for being with us today. And yeah, carry it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sergio, for the introduction. Anybody who wants to pronounce that particular Icelandic volcano, you can just say Aya, and you can get away with it. So that's a shortcut tip for anybody. Just say Aya, it's good. So yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to the department today. Today, I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, an aerosol journey. So for those who don't know, aerosols are small particulates which are suspended in the atmosphere. And when we're interested in aerosols in terms of science, people normally look at this in terms of their interactions while they're still suspended within the atmosphere. So things like how they're interacting with solar radiation or how they go on to form clouds, like the beautiful ones which we're seeing go past the screen right now, or more and more people are really very much interested as well in the human health impacts of aerosols. And that's actually not what I'm going to talk about today. What I want to talk about is the end of their atmospheric life cycle. For a lot of science, that seems to be where they believe aerosol science stops. But in fact, actually, there's a whole nother component to understanding the aerosol journey once it has been deposited back to the ground, in the fact that they can actually transport nutrients from one location to another and have very interesting impacts on the Earth system. And in doing so, when thinking about this science, we're kind of covering the full land, atmosphere, ocean continuum. So it's a really nice lens into trying to understand some of the ways in which the Earth system is connected and how it works. So I always like to start any aerosol talk, no matter what I'm doing, with this beautiful animation or one of its subsets from NASA. They do such a good job here in showing aerosols and how they're moving around the world. So what we're looking at here is the 2019 aerosol trajectories. In different colors, we have different aerosols from different sources, which is important. So in the orange coming out from Northern Africa, we've got a really large kind of dust source that you can see there. There's kind of pink and white colors, which are dominating over industrial areas. So particularly on the east coast of America, we've got China, we've got Europe. That's anthropogenic aerosols. The blue swirls which are going around, that's sea spray aerosols. And then in the red, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, that's wildfire or prescribed burn, any type of fire aerosol. Anybody who works in fire science will probably be aware that this particular time point here that we're looking at, that summer, austral summer of 2019, was a very large mega fire occurred in Australia, and you're kind of starting to see some of that aerosol plume come out of Australia now. Here it goes, and we'll dig into some of the impacts of this particular fire later on in today's talk as a case study. One of the nice things about watching aerosol go like that is that you can see how spatially inhomogeneous it is. So there's a lot of diversity here, and that's to do with the life cycle, lifetime that aerosols spend in the atmosphere, which is just from a couple of days up to a couple of weeks. And that means that their impacts are on the regional to the absolute maximum, the hemispheric scale. So it's got short atmospheric lifetime as compared to the longer greenhouse gases, and their impacts are much more regional than on the global scale. So I was also asked to come up with a more snappy title for this talk, and just kind of keep this kind of question maybe in mind as we're going through this talk, and then you can come to your own conclusion at the end. But I kind of like this phrasing, this prose here, trying to understand whether in fact fire and water can mix to create life. And the first point of the talk today, in getting towards whether or not you believe that this can happen and whether it's something we should be paying more and more attention to, is to understand the role of aerosols in biogeochemical cycles. So why are we interested in aerosols in biogeochemical cycles? Why do they play a key role? So I just want to take the lens of wildfires here to give the kind of phrase out the setting for us. And what we're looking at here is a schematic of a fire from its inception all the way through in time, from seconds all the way through to years, until the ecosystem itself has recovered. So that's going from the left through to the right, the evolution of the impact of the fire on the landscape. And you can see that there's two plumes here. Normally, when we're thinking about fires, we'll probably be thinking about that very first plume. So that's actually the fire itself. So within that smoke plume, you've got the combusted materials of the vegetation. So the aerosol particles, which are formed by the combustion of the vegetation. But also the fire itself produces very strong pyroconvective updrafts, and it sucks in soils from its local environment. And they end up in that smoke plume as well. So that smoke plume is actually a dynamic mixture of both the dust from the local soil environment as well as the combusted material from the vegetation which is being consumed. The aerosol emission to the atmosphere doesn't actually end once the fire is extinguished, and it carries on. So if you remove the vegetation from the landscape, you now have a bare, erodible soil, and that soil can release more dust, in fact, until the vegetation recovers sufficiently that the soil is no longer exposed and producing these dust plumes. So when we're thinking about the impact of a fire, particularly from an aerosol point of view, I think it's important that we not just think about the plume itself, but this integrated impact over time in terms of the total perturbation, the impact that the fire was having on the atmospheric composition. From the biogeochemical cycle point of view, the things that we're particularly interested in the smoke plume are the nutrients. So We have within there, we have nitrogen, we have phosphorus as major nutrients. We also have some micronutrients, we have iron, we have a whole bunch of other ones. And it makes sense that these nutrients would be present because they were part of the growth of the biomass itself. And they also exist in the soils where the plants are taking them up themselves too. So these nutrients do exist within that local environment, and now they're being transported within these smoke plumes. And just to give you an idea of how frequent those post-burn fires are, there was a very large study undertaken just recently where they analyzed over 150,000 large fires, and they found that on average, you're probably looking at about 1 in 2 large fires are succeeded by these dust emissions as well. So it's a pretty common occurrence, in fact, that you will have this legacy impact on the landscape. So here is an example of a biogeochemical cycle on the right-hand side. I just want to point out that all of this is interconnected, and we're only going to look at part of this cycle in today's talk. So we've already started by thinking about how nutrient aerosols are emitted to the atmosphere from their surroundings using the example of fires, and we'll get onto some other examples within the talk as well. That isn't the only, in fact, way that we can get nutrients within the atmosphere. So some of these nutrients, particularly things like iron and phosphorus, they're not all bioavailable. And what I mean by that is that only a certain fraction of the total amount of these nutrients is actually accessible to biota. Some of it is locked up with very strong, for example, oxygen bonds, so things like hematite, and very strong Fe2O3. It's not going to be bioaccessible to the plants. It's iron and these other nutrients which are in a different state, which the plant can take up. Now, actually, while some of these minerals are within the atmosphere, they can undergo a series of chemistry reactions, particularly with acids and organics, and that helps to liberate a second portion of this bioavailable part of that total pool. So you have a certain amount which is bioavailable at emission, and then during transport, iron can undergo chemistry, which allows it to increase its bioavailable fraction. And so at deposition, actually, the amount which is being deposited, which is available for biota to take up, was in fact larger than the amount which was originally actually emitted. And then what we're interested here is then, okay, so once that nutrient has been deposited, particularly to remote ecosystems, which may be starved in particular nutrients, what impacts does that have on the ecosystem, on the fertility of these remote ecosystems? And we're going to take the lens today of marine ecosystems, although for sure it also matters for the land as well. For example, phosphorus being transported from Africa through to the Amazon basin. But for today, I want to just focus in on the ocean. And from the ocean perspective, if you create more nutrients being deposited, you can have photosynthesis occurring. Photosynthesis within the ocean is taking down a certain portion of the atmospheric CO2, and then an even smaller portion of that CO2 can get locked away for a long time. So there's an interesting question there. And if you are fertilizing the oceans, how much carbon drawdown are you actually getting through that fertilization effect from the aerosols, and how much is that removing from the atmosphere? And that's where we're going to end today's story. But the story itself of the biogeochemical cycles doesn't end there, and there's all sorts of interesting feedbacks, including how more different aerosols can be released back to the atmosphere and how they can kind of feed back on the aerosol emission themselves. Is that a question in the chat or not? Unfortunately, my Spanish is not great.
Not now, no, don't worry.
No,
Okay,
no.
great.
Thank you, though.
No worries. Okay, so what evidence do we have, in fact, that aerosol can induce a fertilization effect? The first one that we can look at is where people have gone out on ocean research cruises. They've taken basically buckets of water from over the side, and then they've added aerosol to that, and they've watched to see if there is a change in the chlorophyll A concentration. So that's a measure of whether or not there was a response from the biota in the water. And when they're doing this artificial aerosol addition to that seawater, they can take aerosol from different sources. So in the figure on the right-hand side, if it's a circle, it means what they've done is they've added aerosol from a mineral dust source. In the diamond, it's from an anthropogenic source. And in the squares, it's from a volcanic source. And across all of the literature, when you have a little look, we found 70 different studies. And yes, indeed, on average, there is a response in the chlorophyll A change of about 80% more chlorophyll A being observed at the maximum in response to that addition of aerosol. So that does suggest to us, in fact, yes, aerosol does contain the nutrients in a way which they can access and they can utilize that to increase productivity. But you'll also see, so that was in blue, the pluses are in blue, but if you look to the red, you can also see sometimes there is in fact decreases in productivity. So they've actually measured a decrease in the chlorophyll A amount, or quite often in a cross, there was actually no response at all. So it's not always going to be positive. There are many other reasons as to why there may be no response. For example, just the nutrient that was required by the biota just wasn't present in that particular aerosol type, or that the aerosol itself was inducing a toxic effect. For example, large amounts of copper can induce a toxic effect and therefore actually cause phytoplankton to die rather than to actually grow. The interesting thing about having kind of a meta study like this and having all these different sources is then you can break down that by source as well and say, okay, well, how much productivity was by each of these different sources. And when we do that, we see an interesting pattern coming out, which is that mineral dust. If you add a mineral dust aerosol source, you get an increase on average across all of these different studies of about 70%. But if you're adding a pyrogenic source, that's a very different type of aerosol. And in fact, the increase in chlorophyll that's being measured is about 50% more. So the question then is, well, why is that? What is it about the composition of this particular aerosol source? What does it contain, which is suggesting that it may be more of a fertilizing effect than potentially just mineral dust? And that's important because much of the research for the last 30 years has focused on mineral dust as a nutrient, particularly in terms of iron, but it hasn't really thought about these other aerosol sources and whether or not they could also be having a fertilizing effect. And what we're seeing here is, in fact, that yes, they can, and potentially that fertilizing effect is, in fact, larger than mineral dust itself. Note that in none of these studies yet there's a wildfire source. So anybody who wants to go and do this, please take some wildfire ash and take it to the ocean and measure some chlorophyll. I would love to hear what you saw at the end of that. Another way that you can look at it is other people have also gone out and done similar experiments, both bioassays, like I was just saying, there were really large scale ones where they've taken ships and they've just dumped a lot of iron over the side of the ship and just watched whether there was a very large mesoscale kind of response in the phytoplankton. And if you're doing it this way around, instead of looking per source, you can look at what particular nutrient types are limiting phytoplankton growth in different ocean regions. So what we're looking at here is a plot where we're looking at the nitrate concentration in the ocean. So that's the major nutrient which is required for growth. And then we're looking at, in the circles, we've got all of the different types of other nutrients, which when they were added, they caused a stimulation of the biota to cause a growth. And what you'll see there is where you see high nitrate concentrations, normally the nutrient which is limiting growth is iron. So if you add a little bit of iron into these regions with high nitrate, you're going to end up with phytoplankton responding to that and phytoplankton stimulation. This is called the high nutrient low chlorophyll regions, or HNLC for short. And they end up taking an awful lot of interest from the scientific community. And iron in particular, this is why iron gets a lot of attention and focus. And a lot of today's talk will end up talking, not exclusively, but a lot of today's talk will talk about iron and its addition, particularly in these HNLC regions. So of our three major sources that we're going to look at today, nitrogen, phosphorus, and mainly on the iron, how much is coming from different types of emission sources throughout the world. And what we're looking at here on the right-hand side is ternary plot. We have anthropogenic and fire sources, or if you want to combine them together, pyrogenic sources, so something with a combustion process, some heat involved in producing those. On the orange, we have that mineral dust source, and then in blue, we have other natural sources, so things like volcanics and biogenics or sea spray. What we can see if we look at the total nitrogen, so Tn here, we can see that's very much dominated by anthropogenic sources in terms of where the nitrogen in the atmosphere that we see is coming from. And our minerals, our total amount of iron, our total amount of phosphorus up here at the top, that's really dominated by the dust source. But as I was saying earlier, it's not that total part that we're really interested in necessarily when we're talking about that biogeochemical cycle, that ecosystem fertility. On the left-hand side, it's this soluble fraction, this fraction which we're going to class as bioavailable. And you can see when we're looking at that fraction, that in fact that has a much more mixed source. Again, highlighting this point that we need to kind of look at this more holistically in terms of all of the different sources of aerosol to the atmosphere and the impacts that changes in not just us, but other ones are going to be having to ecosystems across the world. So to understand some of the spatial distribution in where these aerosol are being transported and what ecosystems they could be impacting, both in the present day and in the future, requires us to develop a modeling framework in order to understand that. So just to start off, I want to explain how we've done that, how I've generated and created an ion model, what goes into the production of such a model, and then talk about some of the results that we're seeing from that model in terms of how, in particular, fires may be impacting biogeochemical cycles in different ocean basins around the world. So the model, the framework that this is based on is the Community Earth System model. Here in the USA, it's one of the premier Earth System models that are available. And by Earth System model, that means it contains all of the different components of the Earth system. So it has an atmosphere component, it has a land component, it has an ocean component, it also has ice cryosphere components. And these components talk to each other across the model via being coupled together with a sophisticated coupler. So that means things that are going on in the atmosphere can be passed to the ocean, and then it can have a response which feeds back again, for example, to the atmosphere. So within the atmosphere component of the model, we developed the ion model. So that's an extra layer of complexity adding into the atmosphere to be able to model ion as an aerosol. Didn't exist before. We include 3 different sources of the ion being emitted to the atmosphere. We have this big dust source, we have our fire source, we have our anthropogenic source. It's currently under development at the moment to do volcanoes because that's really interesting as well. While it's in the atmosphere, it undergoes these processing and chemistry that I was talking about. So that's allowing a certain fraction of the inaccessible ion to become bioaccessible during transport as it's reacting with acids and organics. And then finally, the model has 2 deposition processes. It can dry deposition and wet deposition and precipitation as well. So we can understand how the aerosol is being lost from the atmosphere, by which process and where it's ending up. So in doing so, what we're actually doing here is we're really kind of coupling these major components of an Earth system model, the land, the atmosphere, and the ocean, through having this nutrient aerosol addition to the model. So first of all, how do we get the ion emissions from dust? That generally is going to be a property of the mineralogy of the soil itself. So the composition of the soil in different parts of the world dictates how much iron is going to be within that dust. So what we're looking at here is 9 different minerals. Well, the 9th one is a kind of a catch-all, really. So there's 8 different minerals and a catch-all. And some of these minerals contain a high amount of iron. For example, hematite, very, very high amount of iron, about 57% of iron. Other minerals like quartz don't contain anything, or calcite don't contain anything. So those soils which have a high iron content, if you're getting dust being emitted from those regions, that dust is going to have a high iron content. If the soil mineralogy dictates that it's got a low iron content, then it's going to have a low amount. So in this way, we can kind of calculate how much iron is being emitted to the atmosphere based on that composition of the soil itself. And it turns out this is a critical component in understanding the spatial distribution of iron from dust, is understanding that soil mineralogy and really being able to kind of parse out what is contributing which fraction to the aerosol content. The next component is the anthropogenic ion emissions. And again, we're looking at the mineralogy here, but in this time, instead of looking at the soil mineralogy, we're interested in the fuel mineralogy. So what type of fuels are we actually combusting, and how is that releasing different amounts of iron to the atmosphere? So we mainly look at three different types of fuels. We look at coal, we look at oil, and we look at wood. And we also look not just at the mineral content within these different fuels, but also how that mineral content changes as a function of the combustion temperature. So just for one example here, if we look at coal and we watch the red line here, which is the hematite line, which I said before, it contains an awful lot of iron. There's about 57% as a weight fraction contained within hematite. And we can see at a low combustion temperature, there's not actually much hematite being released. It's more dominated by sulfates. If we increase the combustion temperature, so we're going from residential through to cook stoves, through to vehicles, that the hematite amount reaches a peak around about 1100 Kelvin. And then if you carried on combusting that coal at higher temperatures, it begins to decrease. And this time it's decreasing because now it's been taken up in terms of magnetite, which is an even stronger oxidized form of iron. And that matters, that chemical composition matters. So it's not just what's in the fuels, but also the temperature under which those fuels are combusted. And we can work that out, and then we can generate emission maps based on what fuels are being combusted in different regions for what particular purpose. And then that will give us an emission estimate of the amount of iron which is being emitted to the atmosphere from there that the model can use. And finally, our fires. How do we generate fire emission estimates? This is based on the amount of black carbon which is being emitted from the fire, and the ratio that is observed of black carbon to iron from various different fuel campaigns that have been taken around the world and different biomes. So the amount of black carbon emitted from fires has been well characterized. It's a primary component of modeling fires. So it's already present in the model framework. So that makes it very nice and easy to use these ratios of iron to black carbon to understand how much iron we have. So for every gram of iron, how many grams of, every grams of black carbon emitted, how many grams of iron would you have? There's different ways that you could do this. In this particular model framework, we do it by particle size. So we look at the fraction of iron in the fine size. So that's anything which is under about 1 micron, and everything in the coarse size, which is above 1 micron. But you could also do it based on the intensity of the fire, or you could do it based on biome of the fire as well, to generate those emission maps to give you an idea of how much iron is being emitted from fires. So now we have and that's a very top level conceptual kind of idea that I just wanted to kind of give you of how we're doing this. Don't want to get too much into the details, but if anybody is interested in some more of those details, feel free to ask later. But once we feed that into the model, and then we run it, we can have a look at the various contributions that these different sources are now having to the total amount of iron being emitted to the atmosphere. So what we're looking at here is a time series from 1980 through to 2015. On the top panel, we have the total iron emissions, and on the bottom panel, we have the soluble iron emissions. On the right-hand side, there's some extra information for those who are interested. I'm just going to focus on the figure for now. And what we can see just at the top figure straight away, if we compare the yellow, which is the dust, to the blue and the red, which is the fire and anthropogenic sources, we can see that the dust is really dominating by at least 2 orders of magnitude in terms of, this is a log scale, I should say. So we're talking about 2 orders of magnitude more iron being emitted from dust across time compared to these pyrogenic sources here. But if we look to the bottom panel, that's soluble iron emission. Once again, that's that bioavailable fraction which is available to biota. We can see that that difference is much, much, much smaller. Again, pointing us to the fact that we really need to be paying attention to fires and anthropogenic sources as a key source of nutrients to the atmosphere. It's interesting when we did this, when we used 3 different model simulations. We used a bunch of different uncertainties around the emissions as well to try and understand the trend. And we didn't really get a trend in either fires or dust over the time period. But what we do see is an increasing trend in anthropogenic activity. So anthropogenic activity is increasing, particularly things like metal smelting in China has really been increasing the amount of iron which is being emitted. But from these natural sources, we're not actually seeing much of a change over the the last 35 years in terms of those sources. So very quickly, as I said, that's not the whole story, because once they're emitted to the atmosphere, there's evidence that you increase that bioavailable fraction. This is a nice study, I think, which kind of shows that quite clearly. Here they've taken observations in Northern Africa over a period of 30 days. They kind of followed a plume. On the left-hand side, we're looking at the soluble percentage. So the total amount of soluble iron to the total amount of total iron as a fraction over time, and they're looking at it as a function of the pH. And what you can see is clearly over time, as that pH has decreased, that the total soluble amount, the total fraction, which is deemed as bioavailable, has been increasing. So we can put that into the model and have a look at that. And if you do, and you look across all of the different observations of iron concentration to that fractional solubility, you end up with this inverse hyperbolic curve across the field data. So this is field data taken from everywhere around the world, all of the different studies that could be found that have both iron concentration and its fractional solubility. The thing about the field data is it can't tell you anything about the source, which is where the modeling really kind of comes in and gives a hint. And when you look at it by source, which is this one on the right-hand side, the higher the color here is representing the larger the fraction which was coming from that combustion source. So we can see that when concentrations are quite low, it has a high solubility, and that's really being driven once again by that pyrogenic and fire source, as compared to when concentrations are really high and we've got that low solubility, and now that's being driven by that dust source. So this helps once again kind of collaborate what we were seeing here with these particular emission trajectories over time. What we're really interested in then is, okay, so we understand the sources, we understand some of the chemistry, where is that aerosol ending up? Okay, which sources are depositing how much nutrient, particular iron, to which ocean basins, and what impact is that having? So it turns out you can actually do some source apportionment work to work out the geographical distribution of ocean basins based on their sources, and it comes out that there's 4 different regions of the world you can characterize. In the top left here, this region here, that's dominated basically by the equatorial and the North Pacific. You can have a second region, which is the North Indian Ocean. You can have a third region, which is the North Pacific Ocean, and you have a fourth region, which is the Southern Oceans, including the Southern Ocean itself. And if you look at the integrated amount of deposition over these basins, very clear signals come out in terms of the sources. Sources here we have in orange, we have the dust. In red, we have that fire source. In blue, we have the anthropogenic source. And in purple, we have the combination of the fire and anthropogenic, so that pyrogenic source. It takes us a second to describe this plot because it's not always familiar or intuitive straight away. But what we're looking at here in the plot, it's each month of the year, so from January through to December, over that 35-year period in which I showed you the emissions before. But for each point, for each month, is the amount that's being deposited per day for that year. So what you can see in each month is you can see both the interannual variability here across the different months by looking here. And if you look at the whole time series, then you can get the seasonality. So it's a way to both combine interannual variability and seasonality into one nice plot. We can clearly see for both regions 1 and region 2 that they are clearly being dominated by a dust source. The iron, which is coming into the ocean, is coming mostly from dust. There's no real seasonal cycle in terms of the dust in region 1, which is mainly coming from North Africa, whereas there's a really clear seasonal cycle in the dust which is being deposited to the North Indian Ocean, which is mainly coming from the Middle East. In comparison, regions 3 and regions 4, now, if you recall, these are also the regions where I showed you earlier that have that high nitrate, low chlorophyll region. So these are also the regions that we know are sensitive to that iron deposition. So this is the regions where we're really interested in what is reaching the deposition of the iron to these different ocean regions and where that's coming from. And here we see a much more mixed signal, including that there still is some seasonality in the dust dust is strong. But in region 3, outside of the dust season, these other sources, the fires and the anthropogenic, are equally important. Whereas in region 4, that the fire is in particular is a very important and large source of iron being deposited to the Southern Ocean, potentially equal to or even higher than the dust source at its peak. So now we've got an idea of the fact that fires might be an important source of iron. And what observational evidence do we have that there may in fact be an important response in the biogeochemistry? And for that, I just want to focus in on that Australian megafire of 2019-2020 that we saw earlier in the animation. Here you're looking at two satellite pictures. In the top part, you're seeing the fire itself, which consumed no less than approximately 20% of the forests along the east coast. And on the bottom bottom satellite figure, what you're seeing is that plume coming out over that Southern Ocean, the South Pacific region. So all of that smoke containing all of these nutrients, including iron, being really transported out over the ocean. And again, that matches up to that animation that we saw earlier. At the same time, these authors, Tangetel, what they did is they had a look at the satellite chlorophyll, and they had a look at the anomaly in the chlorophyll concentration compared to its baseline. And what they saw, in fact, at the same time as that smoke plume was coming across, it was an exceptionally large increase in the chlorophyll in those spots downwind of the fires. So they then wanted to quantify how much of a change that might mean in terms of the productivity. So if you integrate over these two square boxes here, you end up with the orange bars on this plot here, and then the blue bars on the plot are the general climatology. And you can see that for a very large time period during this year of 2019-2020, that it was elevated, and net primary productivity integrated over those basins, those squares, was a lot higher than the climatological average. In fact, about 20% higher than what it normally is. You can do the same for the export. So how much carbon, extra carbon was exported from the system due to that productivity. So that CO2, which is being uptaken during photosynthesis, and then you get the same number, 20% more CO2 drawdown than potentially above the climatology. What I think is really, really interesting about this is then you can say, okay, well, if you add up all of that carbon, extra carbon that was being sequestered due to this fertilization effect in the ocean, how does that compare to the amount of carbon which was emitted in the fire itself? And when you do that, you end up with a number which is almost equal to, and in fact opposite of, the amount of carbon which was emitted in the fire. In terms of carbon budgeting, if this is true, if this process is important, this is important to note, this is one case study, and there's a lot of uncertainty in here. This is a first attempt to try and understand this. But if these, even half of this amount, if this is true, then it really needs to be accounted for in the way that we think about how the carbon cycle works, to get a full carbon budgeted amount. If there is a significant amount of carbon dioxide being sequestered due to downstream fertilization effects in the ocean, then that really needs a rethinking, a reshaping of the way we think about the carbon cycle. And part of that is because wildfire, when we've done our modeling, we found that wildfires actually are much more efficient at stimulating that carbon export cycle than dust is, and of a factor of approximately 6 to 9, so up to 10 times more stronger stimulation of the carbon export if the iron was coming from a fire source. The other surprising thing about this particular event wasn't just the size of the phytoplankton bloom, which, by the way, is in fact approximately the same size as Australia itself, was also its duration. It carried on for up to 9 months. The fire certainly didn't last for 9 months. So how did this phytoplankton bloom hang around for so long? And that duration was also a key component in the fact of how large that carbon sequestration number ends up being. And this relates back to the plot that I showed earlier on, which is you have to think about the fire's impacts on the integrated timescale. So The initial plume, that big pulse of the fire itself, which was consuming a very large amount of the forest in Australia, that supplied a very large amount of iron, which started the bloom. But then you had a trickle effect afterwards where the dust from the post-burn landscape was able to just keep on topping up the iron. So the iron was being internally recycled by this large bloom, and it was receiving enough of a top up from the post-burn dust to keep it going in time. So that's what allowed it, and these authors have suggested allowed it to actually be sustained over that large period of time, both the fire itself and also its impact on the landscape, which was allowing this post-burn dust to occur. So that's one particular case study of where we've now seen a response of the ocean biogeochemical cycles to fire activity. You can also look at this from a modeling point of view and try to work out, okay, well, where else might this be important? And you can do that by running two simulations, one with fire iron on, and you can run a simulation where you turn the fire iron off, and you look to see where there was change in productivity. And here what we're looking at is the annual mean net primary productivity in the color bar in the ocean. And what you're looking at in terms of the stippling is where there was a response in that net primary productivity. So in the biota responded to an iron source from fire. So it's covering much of the ocean. So anywhere that is upstream of those cross-hatching, if there's a fire source which is changing, it could be having a downstream effect on the biota in that region. Anyone who's eagle-eyed, you might see that the Arctic Ocean doesn't have any crosses in it. And that's because the Arctic Ocean is in fact not iron limited, it's nitrogen limited. But wildfire isn't just producing iron, it is producing all of these other things, including nitrogen. So that opens the question, can it potentially produce enough nitrogen as well to stimulate productivity in a different ocean basin using a different nutrient? And here's a study we had out last year, which does in fact suggest that yes, it can. So in the left-hand side, once again, we're looking at an anomaly in the chlorophyll in the bottom here. So in the summer of 2014, we noticed a large phytoplankton bloom in the Arctic Ocean against the climatological mean of this century. The ocean scientists had a look at this. They couldn't find any internal source for that nitrogen. So that's when they looked up to the atmosphere and they were like, is there a potential source coming from outside of the ocean, which could help to stimulate such a large bloom? And again, it turned out that yes, there was a large fire in Siberia at that time, which could have supported the bloom. And this particular story has also caught a lot of attention around the world. This is a nice figure which was drawn by the World Wildlife Federation for us, to kind of show the overarching schematic of what's going on here. And again, it's that forest fires which are producing nitrogen, which is being deposited now to the ocean, and that's what's stimulating the bloom. What's particularly interesting, I think, about the Arctic ecosystem is that you also have peat fire burning here, and peat has accumulated a lot of nitrogen, a lot of carbon over time. So it's a really large nitrogen source, and that turned out to be a critical component in closing the budget. You didn't account for peat fires, you wouldn't have enough nitrogen being deposited to the ocean to sustain that bloom. But if you do account for peat, then it can. And that opens up questions about the future of the Arctic ecosystem under climate change, where we're seeing that permafrost thaw right now, the peat fires are increasing. Is that going to have impacts on the ecology of the Arctic Ocean? Is yet to be seen, or is this a one-off event? But certainly this seems to suggest that there is the potential for fertilization in the Arctic Ocean from peat fire occurring in Siberia. And here's the modeling just to kind of back up that schematic there. In this one here, what we're looking at is the nitrogen emission. So here's the fire here itself. Here's that section of the Laptev Sea that you're looking over here. In red, we're seeing the transport pathway. So yes, that nitrogen was being transported in the correct direction. And in the modeling estimates of the total amount of nitrogen deposited to that sea area and its anomaly, and you can see that they are quite large amounts. And when we do the budget, that was enough nitrogen to support the bloom. So finally, I think I just want to kind of finish up the talk thinking about the future. So this degree of human alteration here that we're talking about, how far may climate change and other human elements change these biogeochemical cycles, and particularly looking at this through the lens of fires and potential increasing fire activity, particularly in the exotropics, and how that might change future biogeochemical cycles. This is particularly important because we're also actually in the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science right now. So the United Nations has a particular focus on understanding the future health of the ocean, but no one's really thinking about it in this full land, ocean, atmosphere continuum, particularly in terms of wildfires. So there's a lot of discussion and conversation to be had here, I think. So again, we go back to modeling. This time, we're not talking about the atmospheric modeling, we're talking about the ocean modeling, so the ocean biogeochemistry, and understanding the changes in those biogeochemical cycles in response to a change in ocean deposition amounts. I just want to start off just very quickly with this plot, because I think, again, it's very interesting. So the nice thing about any model, of course, is you can create unrealistic worlds as well as trying to create realistic ones. In the top plot here, we're looking at all of the different types of phytoplankton which are within the model and how they are iron limited in the present day. So this is a very similar plot to the one that we saw earlier with the observations. But in the bottom plot, what we've done in the model is they've actually turned off iron supply totally from the atmosphere. And so there is absolutely no iron anymore from the atmosphere reaching the ocean. And when you do that, when you remove that source, basically all of the world's oceans, bar the Arctic Ocean, becomes iron limited. So iron from the atmosphere is important, and in the model you can take it to the absolute extreme and kind of say, yes, actually there wouldn't be any other sources which would be able to supply enough iron to keep those biogeochemical cycles going at the same rate as they are today. So we're looking at two scenarios, but I see I'm actually running out a little bit of time. We're looking at two scenarios, both the present day and the future. It's encompassing this full cycle here. We've looked at the emissions, and we're looking at the deposition to the ocean, and then we're going to be looking at the response in the primary productivity. The change in emissions is due to both changing industrial activity, climate, and land use change. Importantly, in these biogeochemical cycle simulations, we're holding all other sources of iron fixed, so it's only the atmosphere's source which is changing, and all climate forcings are also fixed, so we can just diagnose the impact of aerosol changes on biogeochemical cycles. And this is what you get. So at the end of the century, we predict that there's going to be a lot more, potentially twice as much iron being deposited to the southern hemisphere oceans as compared to today. The northern hemisphere oceans is going to look pretty much the same. And this duality here is coming about because in the southern hemisphere, we're estimating there's a lot more fire, which is generating a lot more iron deposited. For the northern hemisphere, we're also getting fire, but we're also getting a reduction in industrial activity due to air pollution acts and phasing out fossil fuels. And so those two are actually balancing each other in the northern hemisphere. But in the southern hemisphere, you're getting a large signal from increasing fires. In terms of the biogeochemistry, we see that there's not actually too much of an impact in terms of the net primary productivity. So there is an impact in changes of primary productivity, but it's not too high. But what's interesting from the carbon export point of view is that when you add a fire source in particular, you end up with a change in community structure. So the type of phytoplankton which can outcompete other types are larger phytoplankton when you add a fire source. These larger diatoms are heavier, they can sink faster, and that means per gram of fire iron which is being deposited to the ocean, you're getting a higher amount of carbon export. And that links back to that number I was talking about earlier about why you're getting 6 to 9 times more carbon export for a fire iron source as compared to a dust source. It's because you're actually changing the community structure, and not just necessarily the primary productivity itself, but you're pushing the community towards larger phytoplankton which sink out faster. So then we end up with a larger sink in terms of the carbon exported. I'm going to skip over that one and that one because I've said it, and leave a little bit of time just for any questions that may arise. So what I'm showing here is just in terms of the future and present day biogeochemical cycles from the ocean point of view. There's much, much more, I think, research that can be done, particularly around iron as a aerosol, including things like its health impacts, but also what happens with the fertilization effects. If you end up with cyanobacteria, they're also very, very dangerous. Within the atmosphere, we've got iron radiation interactions. If we are looking at changes in phytoplankton, what about impacts higher up marine ecosystems to fisheries? And who's responsible? Is this fire iron, these fire sources? Is it pollution when we're thinking about the ocean? If it has a fertilizing effect, this is a bit of a philosophical question for people to ponder. And if it is still pollution, who's held liable and what is their responsibilities? Many questions, and I always like kind of coming to talks to kind of reach out to different communities and talk about interactions across what I'm doing, what other people are doing. So I very much welcome that discussion. And I'll just finish up here with an overarching summary of what I've been talking about in terms of iron, nitrogen, and being transported from fires in different regions of the world to different ocean basins. And one that I didn't mention, but I wanted to highlight once again, was the fact that phosphorus, in fact, can be transported from Africa to the Amazon basin via fires as well. So that's potentially another important biogeochemical cycle, but a land-based one this time rather than an ocean-based one. Okay, thank you very much.
That was a really interesting talk, Douglas. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that some of our researchers have a lot of questions. And I can see Stain and Joao just jumping in with the cameras right on. We don't have a lot of time left, but feel free if you want to stick around and talk a little more and ask questions. So Stain, please go ahead.
Hey Douglas, thanks for the very nice talk. Yeah, really nice overview. I have a couple of questions. I also, well, one quick thing in Spanish. Si hay personas que no quieren hablar en inglés, pueden decirlo en español y yo, Sergio, vamos a traducir, ¿sí? Pues para que no se sienten limitados.
Ok, gracias,
Just
profe.
so that people can ask questions in Spanish and I will translate. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One of the nice things was like this comparison with the carbon cycle. And it's funny because like when I started my PhD, like more than like 40 years ago, more or less like fires, you have this net source of CO2 from like burning the biomass, right? And so it was always viewed from like a kind of net source of CO2. And then of course people like, well, over long terms, the vegetation kind of grows back, right? So in the kind of natural system where you don't have like a land transition, in fact, it should be like net zero almost, right? And so now you suddenly add like this kind of net sink almost. So you burn your forest, it grows back, so balance zero, but it did fertilize like part of the ocean. So all in all, like if you take everything together on like semi-long time scales over a couple of decades, you almost would end up with a net carbon sink due to fire. Is that right?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. So one, yeah, I thought it was super interesting when looking in the carbon budget kind of things. Like, so there's also a really big movement in the soil community as well, because they're saying, hey, you're looking at carbon from an above ground point of view, but actually the fire regenerates the soils and it ends up with a larger sink. So you have above ground, below ground, but don't forget that the world is 70% water. So you have the whole of the oceans as well. And if you add all those up, are you going to end up with a position, in fact, that you are ending up in a net zero or, in fact, a negative emission scenario? I am not under any circumstances here saying that the fix to climate change is to go and burn down the boreal forest as a way to solve our problems. That is not the way out of climate change. However, from a hypothetical and the future in which there may be more fire in these kind of regions, which can have these larger scale impacts, I think absolutely needs to be talked about. We're talking about carbon budgets, we're talking about carbon credits, we're talking about MRV, we're talking about, MCDR and all these kind of things. If you're not taking an integrated view, then I would be strong enough to say that I think that you're not doing it right. Your MRV is not going to be right. You're measuring verification. If you're not looking at the full cycle and you're not looking over the right time frame, how on earth can you understand whether or not anything to do with carbon capture or anything like that is actually correct as well?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have a couple of more questions, but I want to like let other people ask, and then if no one else asks, I can ask some more things.
No tenemos manos levantadas, profe, entonces bien pueda, si quiere, hacer otras preguntas. Ah, el profe Sergio, sí.
I have more like a
Okay,
not such a philosophical question, but more of a practical question. So, for example, that plume of smoke from Australia, and it has this 9-month period where it's having a positive effect on chlorophyll concentration. What's the plume doing to the temperature of the atmosphere as it's traveling?
Yeah. So this was fascinating. So this plume, because of the power, how much fuel was being burned, this was an unusual case where the pyroconvective strength of the plume actually injected a lot of that aerosol into the stratosphere. So normally when we're thinking about aerosol, we normally think about their interactions in the troposphere, the cloud interactions, and the direct impacts. But here actually there was a stratospheric component to it as well. So it was unusual in that way. It was more of a whole atmosphere problem. But in terms of in general, what happens on a normal fire plume, you would end up with increased amount of aerosol overall. Some of the aerosol warms the atmosphere, some cools the atmosphere. On average, it's always a cooling effect. That's what modeling always shows, that they do have a cooling effect. And then they go on to create clouds, denser clouds, brighter clouds, which hang around for longer. So there would be an extra cooling, short-term cooling, in terms of the fire aerosol in the troposphere. And then you have a long-term reduction of the CO2, which you could class as a more longer-term reduction in cooling as well. So there's a short-term impact, which is what you're talking about in the atmosphere, and then you've got this longer-term if you are indeed removing significant amounts of CO2.
So wow, so it's like a double bonus. Seems to be some sort of a double bonus, because then you have
but
the
again, don't
drawdown.
go burn down all of the
No,
Australia's forests.
I'm not even questioning that. So then my second question and final question is, I know this is on a very large huge scale, but I presume that a forest fire from eucalyptus trees in Australia, it's very different from the smoke produced by burning down Amazonia. So those different kinds of smokes will have different concentrations of I don't know, nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. Has anybody looked at different types of forests being burned and the smoke they produce and the consequences in the ocean?
Oh, that's a big question. Yes. So first of all, absolutely, any composition of aerosol is directly related to its source, fires or not, for sure. And different types of ecosystem burning will release different amounts. So normally what we do from the modeling point of view is actually take a very high level approach to that. So we look at it from like temperate forest versus tropical forest burning. And then there's a certain amount of something emitted per gram of consumed part. We don't get into normally eucalyptus, versus say like a Douglas fir or something like that. But certainly there is potential for differences. For example, when I was showing the peat burning, which is a very different type, very, very densely packed full of nitrogen, as compared to the forest around it. If we hadn't accounted for that peat burning with all its extra nitrogen, we wouldn't have been able to close that Arctic budget, because the forest itself, when it was burning, just wasn't producing enough nitrogen per amount of vegetation consumed. But however, the peat did have enough in it. So yeah, it is important to kind of think about these kind of nuances and details, and think about how future burning might be affecting different biomes, and therefore the concentrations.
Thank you, Douglas.
I can ask one more thing, and
a little one.
yeah, well, I remember like from these very long term, like until 2300, like future projections of ocean circulation, that like when you have the melting of like the Antarctic ice, that you get like a lot of upwelling there with a lot of nutrients, which kind of cause like a phytoplankton bloom, but then it starves like a productivity more towards the tropics, right? But now, like in the last like figures that you have all this extra kind of nutrient from the air falling in. Do you think that will compensate one of the other?
Yeah, so there's two things. For sure, like as you warm up the ocean, what ends up happening is that kind of overturning circulation, that part which is kind of redistributing the nutrients from the Southern Ocean to the mid latitudes. And that happens over a longer time scale, because what you end up doing is as you get closer to Antarctica, the downwelling goes into deeper waters. So it just takes longer for that stuff to come back up again. And then the second part, which is I think a really interesting question, is that warming stratifies the ocean layer. So it warms it up, and when you warm up the water, it's not overturning as much, so it's not drawing up as many nutrients from below. And in these simulations, we purposefully didn't account for any of that. So we held all of that the same, so that we just understand the difference in the aerosol. How much an additional aerosol source can offset some of these declines is a very open question. No one's actually done the calculation for 2100, or definitely not for 2300. Very rare to go out to 2300 anyway in climate modeling the world. But it's a great question, and it's, yeah, how much could these changes offset some of these internal components? And that kind of gets back to this whole idea of aerosol nutrients is fascinating, because it's a full continuum. It's land, it's atmosphere, it's ocean. It's not, if you're just thinking about what you were saying, like the ocean science from an ocean science point of view, and you're not kind of considering these other components, you're going to come to a very different answer. So that's why I love this topic, because it draws in a little bit of everything.
Thanks a lot.
Listo,
All
pues yo
right.
creo que ya podemos dar cierre entonces.
Douglas, thank you so much. Thank you for sticking around a little longer. Really insightful and interesting talk. And
problem.
well, yeah, thank
Can
you
I just
once
add one
again.
extra thing just at the end? So I actually have a grant to study more of this. So if there's any students online who are looking for positions next year, if this took your fancy and has inspired you in any way, I would highly encourage you to reach out to me. I'm always open to talk, and I'll be looking for a student next year to be working on this a little bit more.
That's
Well, that's
very
fantastic,
important.
Douglas.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much. Yeah, we'll certainly distribute that good news among his students, and we'll make sure that reaches to our group. Thank you once again. Thank you everyone for staying. Muchas gracias a todos y todas y todos por estar. Tengan un excelente viernes. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.